Welcome to the Legends Behind the Craft podcast, where we feature top leaders in the wine and craft beverage industry with your host, Drew Hendricks. Now, let's get started with the show.
Drew Hendricks here. I'm the host of the Legends Behind the Craft podcast, where I talk with leaders in the wine and craft beverage industry. Last week, I talked with Cheryl Murphy-Dursey, founder and CEO of LibDib. 5 years ago, Cheryl had the vision of empowering small wineries and craft distilleries to take control of their own destiny when navigating the three-tier system. We talked about the challenges it took to build out this system from 0 products to over 10,000 a day. Surrounding yourself with the proper team was one. The other was forming strategic partnerships. If you're a maker looking to expand your footprint, this is one episode you cannot miss. Today is a special treat. I'm talking with Brad and Lisa Warner. They are true wine industry legends. We recently launched their new website for Rutherford equipment rental, and working on the site, we dove deep into their background story, and I could not wait to have them on the show today. Today's episode, it's sponsored by Barrels Ahead. At Barrels Ahead, we work with you to implement a one-of-a-kind marketing strategy, one that highlights your authenticity, tells your story, and connects you with your ideal customers. In short, we help wineries and craft beverage producers unlock their story to unleash their revenue. Go to barrelsahead.com today to learn more. Now, I'm super excited today to talk with Brad and Lisa Warner. Brad and Lisa, they're founders of Rutherford Equipment Rental, which started as a side hustle back in 1991. Today, Rutherford Equipment Rental, it's the winemaker's choice for wine production rentals in Northern California. Welcome to the show, Brad and Lisa.
Thanks for having us, Drew. We're excited to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for being on. Yeah, we usually I'm talking to guests for the first time on the show. We've had quite a history over the past few months launching the site. So yeah, I know your story, and I can't wait to have all of our listeners hear it as well. So give us a little brief background about yourself.
You start.
About Rutherford Equipment?
Oh, Brad, how did you get into the wine industry?
Well, it was actually a job that paid more than the job I had previous.
What was your previous job? I got to know that. I don't think I've asked that yet.
So I was a manager at the St. Helena Chevron in St. Helena.
Mm-hmm.
And my neighbor, where I rented a house in St. Helena, worked at Charles Krug Winery. And very friendly guy, kept saying I should come down to Krug and apply for a job. And I finally asked him, I said, well, what do they pay down there? And he told me. And so it was more than what I was making at the service station. In those days, it was 1967. There was only one new winery in Napa Valley since Prohibition, and that was Robert Mondavi Wineries. I worked at Charles Krug, which was founded in 1858 or 1859. So they had a lot of old equipment, redwood tanks, oak tanks, and the tops of these tanks would leak wine. So somebody needed to clean the tops of the tanks. And as I tell people, I started off at the top, cleaning tops of the tanks, and worked my way down.
I like that. And Lisa, how did you work your way into the wine industry?
Well, I grew up in Sonoma County, did not grow up with wine on the table. But my siblings and I, my parents noticed we were all leaving the area, for work. In Petaluma, there wasn't career paths available. And I remember my dad said to me, there's this wine business, this wine industry thing around here. And, people actually come to visit our area, like, from other parts of the country. That might be something you want to look into. So my first job, I believe my title was purchasing secretary at Robert Mondavi. And one of my first jobs was to type up purchase orders on a typewriter. If you made a mistake, you needed whiteout. And I would fax cork orders to Portugal on a fax machine that was almost as tall as I am. So I'm 5'2", so that thing had to be like 4.5 feet tall. But I started out with an interest in food and thought I wanted to be a chef. Actually went to the culinary academy orientation and was ready to plunk my money down and do that. But I didn't see how that lifestyle would mesh with my other long-term goals. So that's how I got started in the wine business.
That's amazing. So from a purchasing secretary to the master of the top of the barrel. It's been a long journey. Let's give us like the 2-minute elevator version of it. So you went from Krug and give us a
So
story.
I went from Charles Krug and then went to Robert Mondavi in 1970. And
you have to tell them how you met Mr. Mondavi.
Okay, so at Charles Krug, I was full-time employee, 40 hours a week, but I supplemented my income with working at the service station still. And of course, in those days, all the vintners, Joe Heitz, Louis Martini, Robert Mondavi, Peter Mondavi, all of them had to get gas. They did not have drivers then, so they actually would come in, and the majority of them were very friendly. Robert was always very friendly. It was August of 1970 that Robert came in to get gas, and I asked him, I said, what do you got going on down at that new winery of yours? He said, well, come on down and I'll show you around. So I said, okay. So I went down there, and of course it was like a dream come true. Modern, well lit, no oak tank tops to clean. He said, would you like to work for me during harvest? You can work for me at nighttime. And I said, well, I work for your brother, and he said, that's all right. And so I worked day shift at Charles Krug Winery, a full shift, 8 hours. And then I would go down to Robert Mondavi and then work a full 8-hour shift at nighttime. And it wasn't that long. It was 7 days a week. It started in actually September, went through October, November, until about the 10th of December. It was when I started getting 1 day off a week or 2 days off a week. After that stint, Robert had offered me a cellar foreman position at Robert Mondavi Winery. So I gave my notice to Charles Krug and went to Mondavi.
Okay, so he's probably the only person in wine industry history that worked both those cellars at the same time, especially given the background, between those brothers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big deal. And then the other thing is you were there for almost 30 years.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
30 years. How did your grow through those 30 years at Mondavi?
Well, it started at Charles Krug, so I'm not sure how long I cleaned tops. It wasn't that long, but Charles Krug was a union winery, so I became very fascinated about the process of winemaking, and there wasn't a lot of training or teaching back then. It was mostly, just doing your job and then going home at the end of the day. There wasn't a lot of talk about quality or what we were doing with the wines. But if you, kept your eyes open and your ears open, you could see the process of winemaking. And so I learned a lot just through that. And then I think it was the first harvest after that they put me in charge of the fermentation room. Wineries used to have fermentation rooms that were separate from the main winery. So they would just use it during harvest for fermentation. That's not true anymore, but in those days it was. So you had a whole different cellar for just grape receiving and fermenting the wines or the grapes.
Was that for for cleanliness, or was there a reason for that?
Well, back in the day, the bigger wineries would bottle pretty much year round.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So they were getting wines ready for bottling, and you really didn't want the yeast from the new fermentation to carry over into the finished wines. So that's
secondary.
Why they were set up that way years and years ago. And now what happens, basically, we don't bottle during harvest.
Lesson learned.
Usually. I mean, the cellars are pretty much multi-use. The tanks you can use for finished wine or grape juice. So that's the difference between then and now and for fermentation rooms. So I had a lot of the basics. I did a lot of the cellar work, rackings, toppings, sulfur additions, all of that. And then when I went to Robert Mondavi, that's when a lot more training began. Robert would have these inspirational talks, speeches to the crew, and there was probably under 20 people at Robert Mondavi Winery at that time. That's including the retail room and the lab and the cellars and all. So he would always talk about making fine wines, making equal to or better than the first gross of Europe. And of course, none of us knew really what that was in those days. But then he would start doing tastings on a weekly basis where we'd bring wines in, or he'd bring wines in from first gross or top end wineries from around the world. And we'd have blind tastings every Monday.
Being at the Mondavi Winery, you were talking about learning the system, learning winemaking, and then expanding your horizons to a sort of a world view of wine, where Robert would come in and give you kind of blind tastings of some of the better wines of the world. Can we talk about that for a bit?
Sure. So every week, every Monday morning, we would have a 1-hour tasting. Usually there was around 12 wines to taste, and it was blind tasting. So they'd all be poured ahead of time. They'd have Burgundies and Bordeaux from first gross, and then they'd also have local wines from California. Not so much Chilean wines or Argentinian wines, but more from Europe area. They'd have Italian and the French.
What did you learn from that? Like, what happened?
So I'll back up just a little bit. So I was a cellar foreman there, and not really any job descriptions in those days. It was basically, you're in charge of the whole thing, period. So not really knowing what that was, but I was very diligent on making sure things were clean, because wine is a living, breathing thing. And if you go into even a stainless steel tank that's not clean, the wines are going to pick up that character in the wine. So I spent a lot of time on writing procedures for how to clean a tank, how to clean a hose, how to clean the floor, how to clean up after yourself, fittings, all this type of thing. And then came in the French barrels. Now, Robert Mondavi was one of the first wineries in Napa Valley that were really using new French oak. A lot of wineries would use American oak, usually use brandy barrels as filling with wine, but not necessarily a lot of new oak was used in wineries in those days. So oak barrels, real important again to have the proper sanitation there. And there were no procedures for sanitation then for oak barrels. It was kind of, the oak barrels were cared for the same way as oak tanks were, and totally different. So I would start to smell all the 60-gallon barrels before they were filled, and also taste every wine before they were emptied from the barrel. It's a little bit more challenging in those days because the barrels were stacked in pyramids, not on 2-barrel pallets. So you had to do a little circus act to get up into the pyramids. The pyramids were 5 and 6 barrels high, stacked with wood chocks. And you get your nose over there and to smell the barrel, and then a flashlight to look inside of them. And amazing things that I would find. So procedures in those days was to use soda ash in barrels. Soda ash is basically a detergent, to clean things, but you didn't really need to use that in oak because you can't sanitize oak. The best way to clean oak is with hot water, steam, and then to freshen them with sulfur sticks. So what I found with the using the soda ash, many times it was not mixed properly and would be dumped into a barrel. So there'd be a crust of soda ash in the bottom of this barrel that was being filled with wine.
Mm.
So you can imagine what that one barrel of wine with a little bit of soda ash in the bottom of it would taste like. So again, education about tasting different wines, and when it's all a wine that you're familiar with, Robert Mondavi, you knew when there was something off. So when we found things like that, we would, of course, bring the crew together, show them what we found, teach them the proper way to use soda ash. And before too long, we kind of eliminated use of soda ash at all in wood barrels.
Mm.
So it was those types of things. And then, of course, tasting the wines from around the world on these Monday morning tastings, you would start picking up different characters in different regions of wines, and find out, well, that might be Brettanomyces that is in the wine, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that something that Robert Mondavi Winery wants in their wines? A lot of the European wines in those days had Brettanomyces, and it was on purpose. And actually, even today, it's on purpose too in some wines. So it's always an education tasting wines. I think the biggest education is there was usually 14 to 16 people sitting at this table, the tasting table, on a Monday morning. And some of them were from sales or marketing, some from production, but Robert was always there, and Michael, and then later on, Tim Mondavi. So at the end of the tasting, what you had to do is we went through each person to find out what their preference was and why. And so it kind of taught you not humility, but to really be honest about what you're tasting. And I'll have to say, right now that some people would try to impress Robert Mondavi. There was no impressing Robert Mondavi. He wanted to know what you liked and why you liked it. He respected that, even if it was a wrong answer.
Uh-huh.
So it made a lot of people very nervous, and you saw, kind of like you would see maybe back in the grade school years, where people are looking at other people's papers to see what the answer was, and you would see that going on around the tasting table. People were trying to change their scores because they thought, well, maybe they have the right answer. So it was a teaching in actually working with people too. Anyway, it was a multifold teaching experience.
What a valuable experience. And I like that you talked about the processes that you were starting to put in place in Mondavi. And then, over the last 30 years, you've refined those processes for winery equipment and just cellar procedures. And that led to Rutherford Equipment Rental.
Right.
And now tell us how that began. I know the story, and I know that everyone else wants to hear this story too. Or I want everyone else to hear the story. So I'm going to make you tell the story.
So I really saw it actually starting in the late 70s, but really didn't know, even how to go about it. So in the 80s, there were more wineries being built in the Napa Valley. And Robert Mondavi Winery was pretty well respected back then. And a lot of the wineries would come for either advice or to borrow equipment. And I'm not sure I'll just say this, when Christian Brothers Winery was up and running, where the culinary center is now in St. Helena, they came to me and asked if they could borrow my cellar procedure books so they could basically incorporate them in their cellar procedures. So it was no problem. I just gave them the binder of all my procedures, and they took it and copied them and brought the binder back. But I mean, we were trying to help other wineries to make the wines best they could, always answering questions. So when they came to borrow equipment, they'd borrow pumps, hoses, sometimes tanks if we had tanks, but we never had really any small tanks at Mondavi. They weren't real portable tanks. but definitely the pumps and hoses. So in the late 80s, early 90s, I thought, well, maybe I'll buy a couple tanks. And actually, I bought a pressure washer on a trailer, self-contained as well, and started renting that in 1991. And actually, some of my biggest customers were janitorial services, where they'd rent the pressure washer and to clean outside of buildings. But the tank rentals were a little bit slow because people were not really using small portable tanks at that time. But then it caught on. More and more people were interested in portable tanks. I was storing all these at my house in Rutherford, and hence why it's called Rutherford Equipment Rental. And then it got too large for that, and then moved into a warehouse in Napa in I guess it was the late 90s, early 2000s.
That's amazing. How did you get the word out? Is it just word of mouth?
Well, I had an acquaintance, his name was Dave Paddock, and he worked a little bit with me at Rutherford Winery. And I asked him, he worked actually in sales for another company in the Bay Area, and had left them, and I was having to do some work at Rutherford. So I knew he was in sales, and I said, I need to get some advertising done. Dave, would you be interested in going around, to wineries and dropping off the brochure? Because he's a real, gentle, soft sell type guy, And so that's how we started,
Can we just clarify what those brochures were? So when Brad says brochure, I mean, spending time in production and marketing, I was mortified, but it worked. It was the most atrocious fluorescent green paper, and it was just a single sheet, just black, like on a copy machine, Rutherford Equipment, and it listed your equipment and pricing, and there was no email.
Didn't have emails.
I know. and it was just, and people would call you.
I want to get a picture of that brochure on your website.
We have one somewhere.
It's got to be on your About Us.
Yeah. So brochure is in air quotes, really.
So you had the brochure, and you were, for the longest time, you were kind of known, had the nickname as being a cult supplier, because people couldn't really find you, or they knew you.
And with
You had to know somebody to find you.
Right. And with limited equipment, not nearly as much as we have now, you didn't want to tell your colleagues because, you only had so many large format corkers to choose from and so many tanks to choose from. And if you told your colleague, then your colleague might get that equipment instead of you. So people kept it very close to their chest as far as, you really had to be in the know.
They didn't want to lose their supply.
Correct.
That's great.
And we know that because people actually have shared that with us.
Like, do you know anyone? Well, they'll give you a wrong phone number just so. But as you guys expanded, and I do know this story, so you did the small tanks, but really the industry kind of caught up to your vision of the smaller tanks and the smaller production and the micro production. And that really allowed you some tremendous growth in the 90s into the 2000s and onward. And then Lisa, when did you come on board?
I came on board in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I had one of those jobs that looks really fancy on the outside. And Brad said to me, I've got this Rutherford equipment and I can either grow it or sell it. And, what do you think about operating it? And my first thought was, well, how difficult can that be? I'd purchased equipment for years, specialized. I got my CPM when I was at Diageo. So I knew procurement, I knew project management. And I said, well, I just, I don't know if you can afford me. And his response was, I don't know if you can afford not to do this. So I tell people I traded in my high heels and my frequent flyer miles for boots and a forklift license, and much happier as a result. But yeah, that's how I came on board. And I worked off of a laptop in a desk in the middle of a warehouse. At that time, there's 2 warehouses, and my cell phone, and I would take calls and run around back and forth. But Brad kept all the orders in a spiral notebook with most of it in his head. And I was a process person, and I couldn't do it. I didn't understand how he could do it. It made no sense to me how he could possibly remember where all these tanks were and when people were done and picking it up. And you were still kind of doing it on the side. You had a full-time job as a winemaker for another producer at that time, Sawyer Cellars. So I said, if I'm going to do this and if we're going to grow the business, things need to change. I need to put processes in place. And the first thing is I developed, what we called at the time a work order, but, it was a reservation for equipment, and started tracking things. And then in 2014, really 15, we added software, rental equipment software. And that was a really big deal. And I know Brad was skeptical at best. So
Giving up my spiral.
Yeah, losing the spiral notebook was hard. And it was a tough transition for him. But in order to grow, as you know, Drew, I mean, we needed those things. I remember back then, we didn't have any help. We had a driver that came on board and worked pretty much on call. But when we wanted to go on vacation, we had to shut down the business. There was no one to run it. And that wasn't sustainable either. So I think the evolution with Rutherford's growth has been, yes, we've added more equipment and we've listened to our customers, but having these processes in place that, number one, make it easier for the customer to rent equipment, makes it easier for us to communicate with them that, it's all ready to go, and having that flexibility. And then we've added to our team, which has really, improved our ability to serve not just our immediate area, but now we're looking at, we've been serving Livermore, the foothills, Sonoma County, Mendocino County, and Lake County for a long time, but now we're ramping that up even more. So
that's fantastic. So the processes are really what helped you kind of scale.
Yeah, because
and the proper team members.
And having the proper team members, and then also just being flexible. I think that, winemaking will humble you. And when we bring new team members on board, we say, look, we have these tools, and we look at best case scenario, but it's winemaking, it's bottling, and the best laid plans. I mean, saying's there for a reason. So our processes allow us to have flexibility as our customers' needs change, even if they're unexpected changes. We've had calls, hey, I need the tank for longer. Literally, the truck with my glass got into an accident and I'm not getting my glass delivery. I mean, crazy things like that. So our systems allow us to still take care of everybody.
To be personable.
Yeah.
And the being personable and that kind of customer centric kind of ethos that Rutherford Equipment has, I think from talking to you guys over the last couple months, that's really what sets you guys apart. Where did that come from? Because a lot of equipment rental places, it's just like you're just moving equipment from place to place and that's it. From what I've seen, it's just completely different at Rutherford Rental.
Well, I just want to say one thing is when I started the business, I said I will not rent anything I wouldn't use myself. So that not necessarily about customer service, but I'm going to at least talk. But the customer service to me, so I was always on the other end. So how people actually responded to you and how they treated you. Because maybe they were the ones in charge, meant everything to me. And, there was only a few that that would treat you with respect, and you would always remember that. And those are the people that you wanted to continue doing business with, that I wanted to continue doing business with. So when Rutherford Equipment came along, it was difficult for me for a while because my job at Mondavi was, I was vice president of production operations. So when I needed something, people would do it for me. And then when we had Rutherford Equipment, now, I had to be on that other end. And when people needed something, I had to do it for them. So you go.
I think when I really learned the lesson, I'll call it the lesson. So I was the purchasing manager for a winery. And at that time, I was in charge of bottling supplies, and we probably had, it's still a small winery. So, but for me, 24 SKUs to manage. It was a thing, in different brands and different varieties. And I was pretty rigid in my ways, kind of like Brad was. I was very rigid. This is what we purchased, and I need to know in advance, and this is where we're going to get. And I remember I got a call from the winemaker that said, well, we need more of this label and less of this label. And I don't think I responded very kindly. And he said, come down to the cellar, meet me in the cellar. And he did a great thing. It was the difference between a single vineyard sub-appellation and a county appellation. It was a Chardonnay. So it was either Sonoma County Chardonnay or Russian River Chardonnay. And he made me taste them. And then he did the blends. And basically what it came down to is because the wine quality wasn't there, they had to reduce the number of the Russian River Chardonnay and put that wine into the Sonoma County label. And it all kind of clicked. It's like, because up to that point, it was just about commodities. I'm ordering stuff, I'm producing stuff, putting together packaging. When the winemaking decision came into it, it's like all my light bulbs went off. It's like, there's got to be a balance between these two. And that really stuck with me. And I think that's what I bring to Rutherford Equipment. And that's what I try to train our team on. And going back to what I was saying earlier about best laid plans. That lesson was cemented for me, in the cellar with a winemaker, and it's never left me. Yeah.
Such a valuable lesson. It's so important to spend just that extra few minutes to kind of understand the person's motivation behind their anxiety or behind their request.
Right.
Because once you understand it, you can give better advice. You can give better recommendations, and you feel that empathy and sympathy towards them.
Right. And the person that is our rental operations manager that takes out all of our reservations, he used to work on bottling lines, on mobile bottling lines. And I think that our whole team has real empathy, for what production people are going through. And like Brad said, we wouldn't rent anything we wouldn't use ourselves, but it's more than a widget to us. We feel, and this sounds hokey, but it's very sincere, that we're a team member in every single cellar. And, that's our client. And we take that role seriously, and we feel the responsibility of that. And I think that's what really drives our business, and the passion and what makes us different. We really do feel like we can't muck it up because it's going to have such an impact to all these other people and their product. Yeah.
Sure. Now, for equipment rental, like talking about today, you've got a winery or you've got a prospective winery that's just popping up. And a lot of times equipment rental is done on a spur of the moment because they just figured out, oh crap, our thing broke, or we don't have the capacity for it. But what advice would you give a winery or a new winery to actually make equipment rental as part of their strategy for doing wine production?
So we always recommend to new startup wineries, or actually even existing wineries, we're here to help you find the right equipment for your winery. Okay. If tank sizes sometimes even can be complicated for a winery, because they'll say, well, I don't think I'm going to use a 500-gallon tank all the time. but then how do I house my 500-gallon lot? And so we say, rent this tank, try it out, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, then you can go to the next size larger tank, or you can buy this 500 or buy a 550-gallon tank. So we help wineries a lot of times, just startup wineries, understand what equipment they both need and don't need by renting the equipment.
The other thing that we try to do is send out emails at certain times of the year and say, hey, we like, for instance, we'll send one out in December. We know you just came off harvest, but it's not too soon to think about bottling. And if you know what your bottling schedule is, and for instance, that your mobile bottler doesn't have large format corkers, you think you're going to need them, call us now and let's get a reservation on the books. Same thing with harvest. Our harvest tank rentals, we ask people to basically wrap up their commitment in, May, to at least get that in the book so that is reserved for them. The nice thing about rentals, like Brad said, is you get a chance to try things out. The other thing is if someone is in a situation where they have limited space, rentals is a fantastic idea because you can use the equipment, whether it's a tank or a filter or whatever, especially if it's something you're only going to use a few times a year. We take care of the maintenance. You get to rent it, and then it goes away. You don't have to worry about storing it. You don't have to worry about maintaining it because there's costs associated with that. We're here so that people can concentrate on the things that they want to concentrate on, and we can kind of take the pressure off of them, for these other types of things.
I can really see that space is such a premium. Land's a premium. I mean, if why rent the land if you can just kind of use the equipment and get it back? And you break up a point that I kind of thought about was, larger wineries, they've got just, and you were talking about tank sizes, they've got such big equipment that if they ever wanted to kind of experiment in some micro production for their wine clubs or something like that, I would think that a rental system would be great for that.
Right. And for this upcoming year, what we anticipate with people having had perhaps a smaller vintage of 2020 wines, they absolutely may not have smaller tanks for that. For bottling. And we can absolutely help as they start taking that out of barrel and decide what they want to bottle. They may only need a 750-gallon tank or a 1,500-gallon tank, and we have those. And so it's been interesting, between the pandemic and fires and things like that. We have found that for one reason or another, and some of them unexpected, there's a need to have things on a temporary basis and not make the big commitment. It's also convenient, I think, for winemakers and production people. If you just have an operating cost and you need something short time, it doesn't need to be a CapEx project. So if you want to get something done, especially in larger wineries, CapEx, it could be 22 months out before you get approval. This way, you can just get it in, get what you need to get done, and move forward. And we see that, especially with our large corporate clients.
That's a very good point.
Easier. Yeah.
Now, I know you guys are kind of expanding out of the valley and increasing your footprint. What are the new areas that you're looking to do business in?
Well, we really want to do more in the foothills, El Dorado.
Yeah, El Dorado, and then Livermore.
Yeah, Livermore for sure.
We're in San Jose, and we've expanded. We have been doing more than wineries. We're helping cider producers.
That is booming right now.
Yeah, all kinds of beverage producers. We have bright tanks available for rent, And if demand continues to increase for that, we'll increase equipment for that. We're looking at getting bottling equipment for these little guys.
What is that little guy?
Well, with more people, well, actually, the guy on there is Brad.
Who is that
it's
guy?
kind of funny. But with the
Antique.
yeah, with people doing more virtual tastings, and maybe customers don't want to buy, a 750 and then the weight of shipping it and all that, you can decant into these small bottles and get these out to your consumers for tasting. So we're looking at adding that equipment. We're going to Italy next year to see if we can work with some of our manufacturers to modify the equipment to better suit the needs of the rental market. So we're constantly looking to grow the business. The reason we have to keep it in Northern California, and this is really important to us, is everything that goes out of here is inspected. It's checked to make sure it worked. But sometimes things happen, and that's someone's asset, their wine. And we need to be close enough to be able to solve the problem. So that's why we can't go out of state, and that's why we can't go to Southern California.
There's a lot of wisdom in that, knowing that controlling your growth to the point that you can keep that quality, to keep that kind of customer service, keep the quality control there.
Yeah. The other thing that we are continue to grow in is that they call Brad the filtration whisperer.
Yes, I wanted to get to that.
So we rent filtration equipment, but they get all your knowledge with that. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So filtration is something that I'm passionate about, and I've done physically for a long while at Rutherford Winery and actually Charles Krug as well. And filtration of a wine to me is very important. I think it's a natural process. So today, filtration is kind of looked at as a bad thing to do to wines. And
because it's easier to type unfined unfiltered on it than actually filter it.
Well, there's lots you can do cross flow processing too, and that's not really a filtration, but kind of a filtration. But filtration, really, the medium that we use or we recommend is cellulose, and it does take bacteria and yeast out of the wines, and it provides your bottle with longer shelf life. So it's not a short-term solution; it's a long-term solution for your bottle life. Filtration isn't for all wines, and like you said, a lot of people would like to put unfiltered on there. But from my experience, a lot of times unfiltered wines, the shelf life is very short because there are different yeast and bacteria that will continue to grow in wines even after they're in the bottle. And there are other things that are used for bottling too that will slow down the growth of these bacteria and yeast, but they're not necessarily the best for wine quality, I don't feel. So when people ask me about filtration, they won't know what filter medium to use because there's all different types of microns, and it can be confusing. So I usually ask them to bring me a sample, just a small little sample tube of their wine. And I ask them a little bit about their wine. Winemakers, are they're kind of like chefs. They're pretty private, and I understand this. They don't want to say too much, but I do need to ask them a few questions about it. And then they're always curious to saying, well, how do you analyze it? Who do you send it to? What do you look at? So about that time, I pull my flashlight out of my back pocket and look at the clarity of the wine. And, I can see them shaking their head thinking, oh my golly, what have I got myself into? But we have a lot of repeat customers. So it works.
I can imagine. What's the biggest mistake people make with filtration? I mean, it's gotten a bad name in different times.
The biggest mistake people make about filtration is not understanding what micron to use for filtering.
And the results what's the results of using the wrong micron?
It's terrible. It's terrible.
Well, it's terrible to your pocketbook, first of all.
Well, you spend a lot of money on trying to filter and the wine's still hazy. So, again, we're here to be a resource. We're not passing judgment on anyone. You can ask any questions you'd like. You can take our advice and either use it or not use it. It's okay, but we want to give you the best advice possible for filtration. And we want you to use the minimal amount of filters you need to save money, but also to save your product too. Because, filtering wines, if you're using the wrong micron, can really beat up your wines and not give you favorable results. So we want to offer the right microns to use and also the sequence to use them in.
Yeah, that's a big deal too.
Yeah, it's really an art.
Well, and I think too, when you're approaching it from the perspective, we want you to do what's best for your wine. We want to help you make the best wine that you possibly can. I mean, sometimes we get calls from customers and we're not able to fill their need. And we train our team on this too. The most important thing is the customer's wine. And if we can't help them then achieve that, then we need to give them a resource, where they can get what they need. And sometimes, we can't. And that's okay. And we get repeat customers then too, because people will always remember how you treated them. And that's a basis for a whole business right there. Really.
That's fantastic. Now, where can people, as we're kind of wrapping down here, where can people find out more about Rutherford Rental and you and Brad and Lisa?
Well, our new website does a great job. Thank you so much, Drew. I mean, what you did for us with our website, I thought as a business to business, especially in the wine industry, and, Brad and I also have a small commercial winery. My thought was, people just want to get the tank and the price and they want to make the call and move on. But you've really helped us tell the story and about, why people should choose us as their vendor and why it's important and the points of differentiation. But all of that is at our website, rutherfordrental.com, and people can do an inquiry request. The other thing about our website is that all our pricing is online. We feel that, especially for startups and things like that, maybe our customers need that information outside of our business hours, and we don't want that to be a barrier to them getting what they need. So everything is there. The only thing that we do not publish is filter pricing because it's so volatile and changing all the time. But we're here Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 4:30. The emails, the phones, all the things. I think we're pretty easy to get a hold of, and we always try to pick up the phone. We're old school that way. So, yeah.
Well, yes, thank you so much, guys, for joining with me. I know we're doing this right during harvest, so I am honored that you guys took the time out today to talk with us, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Drew. We really, really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks.
All right. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Legends Behind the Craft podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.